Or tanning.
Sorry, I record it for the people, the latecomers. I mean, I'm okay with being compared to a surrealist painter. That's great. Is it all the crazy geometric patterns and lines that I have going on in my life?
No, it's the 50s hair.
Well,
That's all.
I didn't have time to actually do it today, so this is what we ended up with. Welcome everybody. Today is very, very special. I was able to con John into joining our discussion today. So, we kind of previously stated, um, uh, John and I went to graduate school together at the University of South Florida. We actually entered the program the same exact year, um, with a group of, I think, what did we start with? 13
Ooh, yeah, we were the
cohorts?
Survivor Island. Yeah, we ended with 6 or 8. How many?
No, it might have been 8. We started with a certain, or 10 maybe. Um, we started
Decagon, yes.
we started with one group of people, and throughout the 3 years that we were in graduate school together, we started to lose some of our cohorts for various reasons.
And then the class after ours had like a huge number of people compared to us. It felt like,
It
and
was
yeah.
We were in a very weird experience because the group that was the year ahead of us, they were all best friends and they all got along. And then we came in and we actually ended up titling our thesis show Irreconcilable Differences, if that gives y'all any indication as to what our year was like. And then, yeah, another group of like 15 people came in after us and they got along like gangbusters. So we just had the reality show version of grad school where there was a lot of infighting and drama. Uh, so yeah, if you guys, I know last week we talked about what it takes to apply to graduate school, but if you have any questions about what the experience of being in graduate school is like, John is a very excellent person to ask. Um, yeah, we'll just go ahead and start there. We've talked about a lot of professional practices stuff lately. And, John and I have both been outside of academia for, oh, what, 8 years now?
Yes.
Going on 8 years. So we have a lot of sort of practical, real world experience, both teaching, but also as showing and exhibiting artists. And you have experience doing nonprofit work as well, starting a nonprofit. So yeah, I guess we'll just open it up. Let let us know what questions you have or what you're curious about. This is meant to be a totally open discussion. So if y'all want to unmute and you can talk over each other, today is the day when we turn the mute buttons off and we just kind of have a nice discussion.
It's free for all, yeah.
Monica is like laughing hysterically. What do you got for us, Monica? What are you curious about?
I don't know. Like I had a third question and I was gonna ask it, but then I forgot. So it's gonna take me a second.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We all have the brain fart moment.
Yeah, I definitely do all the
When
time.
things escape us.
Yeah.
Um,
Emily was introduced me to the new term, the lingering. Was that right? Or the
languishing.
languishing? Yeah, this phase of the pandemic, and I just feel so glazed over, so unproductive, and that kind of thing of forgetting something I just had on my mind is just happening more and more and more. So
Yeah, if you guys haven't seen that article by the New York Times, they released this article I think last week where it was like an editorial post where someone was like, if you're looking for the word that describes the stage of the pandemic we're in, it's called languishing. It is the middle child between uh, like full on like living your best life and depression, and it is the stage that we are stuck in. Um, but hopefully we will not have to languish much further. But I think, John, you worked in behavioral health. You probably have some interesting insights as to what you think the lasting effects of this whole experience is going to have on the world uh, moving forward.
Yeah, it will be really interesting. I mean, I think about like studies of like long-term effects of trauma and how there can initially be decreased resilience, but then sometimes long-term it really creates greater resilience. So that's things with like going back to collective experiences from like I wouldn't compare this to the Holocaust at all, but the Holocaust survivors generationally, there's kind of those patterns that develop. And then even one of the things is that I found really hopeful was the relationship between the Black Plague and the Renaissance, that the Renaissance could not have happened without the Black Plague. And so, and culturally, there's similarities and parallels that, you know, society was very insular and becoming more conservative, but then it reached this point of crisis, and that brought about this kind of flowering of the Renaissance and this humanism and all of that great stuff. So.
Yeah, so sort of the hopeful macro level impact of what comes after these like major inflection points of trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of trauma, do you want to talk a little bit about like your experience, like full on, you got out of grad school, or you could even talk about like the period in between when you were in undergrad and that transition into grad school, because a lot of these guys are if they're not graduating this year, they're sort of looking down the barrel of graduation within the next year or so. Do you want to talk about sort of that oh shit moment when you step outside of academia?
For sure. And just for reference, how long do we have in this until the end of the hour?
Yeah, I mean, it can be until the end of the hour. We usually end up staying until about 2:30.
Okay. All right.
But whenever you have to leave us, you can leave us.
Okay. So yeah, I didn't know how brief to be and stuff, but yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I've had my own. I'll give you guys the full unedited John Allen experience. That, you know, I had like a major mental health crisis when I was at the end of my undergrad, and that totally derailed my path, derailed my focus. And when I applied to grad school, it was, you know, it took me an extra year to complete. But that's how I ended up in the behavioral health field for a little while. Um, and I think it's important to talk about that, to normalize that, and because everyone's experiencing mental health is a need that everyone has, and you know, sometimes you just don't have the resources that you need to get by. But it affected my confidence going into applying to programs, and I was really shut down during grad school, and that kind of affected my ability to communicate and to seek out the best advisors, to be resilient to feedback. But you get through it. So that's one thing. You know, looking back, sometimes I wonder if I would have done better if I'd waited another year or two. But then sometimes you risk like losing your momentum altogether
Yeah.
for that. But then after grad school, I was kind of glad that and it's a funny story that I did an internship just to get out of Florida over the summer when it's the hottest. But it was with the idea in mind that I wanted to get museum experience under my belt and gallery. So I wrote to this random museum in the mountains in Virginia, and I got credit for a class that I needed over the summer and did an online class. But I roomed with a guy who worked in this behavioral health field, peer support, and he told me about his training. And so when I graduated, that was something that I pursued and was able to kind of quickly get not so great, but, you know, good benefits type job, and it gave me structure and stability to move on. So I think um, I'm definitely someone who um, has worn a lot of hats, you know, and I think a lot of times being a creative professional involves conceiving your career creatively and cobbling things together. But I've worked in behavioral health. I would use my art a lot. I would do a lot of self-soothing stuff, and realized how the repetitive mark making I liked actually was not so different than Zentangles or knitting or something. And it was a lot to do with my own anxiety. But then now that I'm teaching, I draw from that background in behavioral health a lot in terms of how I structure questions in an open-ended way, and having kind of access to referring resources. Um, but yeah, I definitely would say that that's one thing that's helped me is having a broader skill set, including museum curatorial. I've done nonprofit stuff in galleries too. Grant writing is something that because there's just stuff I wouldn't have been able to afford to do if I didn't like fly to Texas and take a workshop in tintype. Like there's a pretty high rejection rate, but then a lot of the times, well, I've been pretty successful with grants actually, but what's the worst that can happen is you get rejected, they say no, and grants are free to write. So, but beyond that, yeah, I feel like I'm maybe moving away from the question a little bit, but
when you say structuring your career creatively, what can you unpack that statement a little bit
that sounds
more
like a euphemism, and it kind of is, because it's very difficult to find like a full-time job in not only in art or in academia, but that's just kind of the way that the economy is going, unfortunately. And you know I've been very intentional for myself to kind of get other skills in like museum curatorial stuff, or other fields that I'm interested in working within. And even had to I'm not a kids person, but I have done some workshops with kids, because it's a huge market for that. And I've actually found that has really been fun, and a lot of times in environments like working at the museum, art museum summer camp, like I find that the kids are really engaged. They're kids from good families that like have a lot of support, and so you're not dealing with behavioral stuff. That is what I was really afraid of with kids. So and I find that kids, that it's actually really inspiring. They're like unbridled creativity. They don't have the years of training rattling around in their brain telling them not to, why they shouldn't make this.
They don't have the giant list of don't go there materials or concepts. Okay, Monica says, I think I remembered what I wanted to ask earlier. It's kind of off subject. I know when you were talking about your artwork that you wanted to get an interaction/reaction from the viewers that made them feel uncomfortable or out of their comfort zone. I don't know if I'm wording that right. With your pieces, do you often feel like you're putting yourself through discomfort / the opposite of serenity, or is it just standard at this point?
That's a great question, and I don't think I realized that was the polarity between serenity is actually, I don't know that I would say that I want to make the viewer uncomfortable, but I think I'm interested in this idea with surrealism of like the uncanny, that there's something that at first seems like you accept, but then it lingers with you, and you're like, that was a little bit off. Let me puzzle on that. What was, like the way that dreams are sometimes. But I do think that's great advice, actually, to make yourself intentionally uncomfortable. And I talked about kind of it being in a position going into grad school where I was like kind of shut down from stuff that had happened. But I think at this point, I do sometimes intentionally place myself in situations to grow that will make myself uncomfortable. I will engage with people I've used to avoid who make me uncomfortable, just to learn to grow within moderation or whatever. And like, what is it about this person that bothers me, and like how can I learn from that, or what is it about them that maybe there's something about them that I actually admire or could learn from or benefit from, even if I'm not like out to totally remake myself or whatever. So
I mean, I think discomfort is part of it. Monica, I respond to the word discomfort because that's usually one of the aims of how I work. That like weird anxiety producing uncanny realm as well. It's kind of interesting that we both kind of look for that. Like anytime I look at like your drawings, especially the ones that have color, they have like this weird vibration that happens, which I think is so interesting because I've been told that my work can be off-putting or anxiety inducing, which I'm drawing a parallel between your work and my work simply because I think we both approach making as a form of self-soothing. So I think it's interesting that we both are doing this as like a meditative act of making, and yet the result ends up being this strange, uncanny place that causes you to question stuff. So
yeah, I just watched a documentary last night on Yayao Kusama, and really I never knew a lot of things about her biography, how male artists repeatedly stole her ideas, and like Klaus Oldenburg, for instance, and Andy Warhol, but also she had this extreme battle with mental health issues herself, and you definitely see the repetition as a kind of self-soothing thing, and there's an intensity about that that is captivating, but also like you kind of are like, I don't, if I stay in this world too long, I'm going to drift off into space. And that's, I think, a thing that, you know, when you really engage with creativity in an intense way, that can kind of happen, that is like interesting, but also like not always sustainable.
I think one of the things that I'm curious about, at least, is you make a lot of work, like a lot. Like out of most of the people that I know, even that like we went to school with, your level of output consistently over the years has been like pretty high. And so yeah, I'm interested in what you would have to say about resiliency, what you would have to say about creating a studio ethic, or how do you consistently stay on a path of creating even when it's hard, with juggling, like trying to like you said, approach your career with creative structure, which is basically just like do whatever you have to do to like pay your bills. I'm
Well, I mean,
I'm curious, what's the secret?
So I got a couple of things too. I wanted to go back to that. Is like for me too, that there's value in, even if I'm like, if I'm a little bummed that I'm working multiple jobs or something, if I can at least have all of my work be related to art or education, there's this sense of it's not as demoralizing, because it feels like it's all working together. Which, although I'm almost at a point where I'm just like, it would be easier sometimes to just, you know, whatever, have a regular more corporate job. But yeah, there's this sense of that, you know, um, anyway, kind of just getting back to that is another piece of career advice, is just, if you have an area, you know, just try to retain some focus within your work field. But getting back to output, one of the, when I was kind of in between undergrad and grad school, I met a person who was just a professional artist, and she actually just made money selling art, and her work was at the time in the Virginia Museum of Art. She had a big show, and she worked a lot in this nature vein, and there was some local person who gave me a scholarship to take a workshop with her. But one of the pieces of advice that she said that I still stick with is just treat it like it's a job. Show up, give yourself regular working hours, even if it's just like 1 or 2 or 3 days a week or a couple of hours. Have that routine built in and take it seriously. I've been lucky enough to like have affordable studio spaces, so one of the weird things here has been that someone in the upstairs unused gymnasium of a church started a group of studios that were only like $50 a month, and I just moved out of those into a bigger studio space. But that's been great to just have any space, and even if it's not one you pay for, even if it's a corner. I think Emily, I remember Brianna, our friend Brianna, we went to school with, made her walk-in closet into a studio space. And so whatever you've got to do, that kind of intention. But yeah, that's my advice for that, is setting regular hours. But for me, I think it's like I have a lot of very active mind, and I think this was another piece of advice, maybe not always sometimes questioning it, but is every idea you have, do it, at least to do a small scale version, and because sometimes you don't know where it's going to go until it's out. And that's why I love drawing, is that it's very immediate. You can sort of do everything you think of often, but I try to kind of honor that part of my like creative practice too, is just the exploring new things, even when it feels very scattered, and they connect sometimes, but it takes a while and you don't want to see how they're going to connect.
I remember I was told to not draw and not paint in grad school because they told me it was a waste of my time, because I was in there studying sculpture. But then it's like when I moved up to New York, I was working in fabrication, and so all of my time and energy went into making other people's artwork. And I had no studio space because my entire domestic life was essentially in a single studio apartment that had no room to make anything. It's certainly not three-dimensional. And so that was like the time when I finally like got that stupid little earworm of that like statement from that person out of my head, and I just started drawing again. And like you said, it was just like it's the most it's the most immediate form of getting an idea down on the page. And when I actually did get studio space again, like all those drawings were things that like then became manifest, like in different iterations afterwards. So even I'm just responding to what you said, like even if it's just a corner, even if it's just like your kitchen table, like drawing is one of those things that you don't ever have to give up. Even if you have to give up all of your other studio facilities, you can always kind of have at least a two-dimensional practice, if nothing else. And even that can sort of sustain you creatively for a while.
And one of the things that I think about as a teacher is that realizing limitations are good. Like, I mean, so you think that people given every access to every material or facility need they could ever imagine is going to be the best thing for creativity, but often having something taken away. I mentioned iconoclasm in my lecture, like that, because there is this convention in certain religions to not draw people, like the stuff that developed in Islam, the geometry, the architecture is just so dazzling and amazing to me and beautiful that probably would not have happened had that been more accessible as a language like it is in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about folk artists too, like this stuff that people make with just like random scrap wood, and people, the most important thing is just this kind of almost compulsive need to make. That's what you have to have as an artist. You've got to have a need to make.
Where does that need come from?
Yeah, I don't
know. A lot
know.
of us are struggling with like having the compulsion right now. I know I am. I'm like I really need to find it again.
Well, and I've had that too. Like, unfortunately, mine largely fell during grad school. So some of my experience after grad school has been like, oh crap, I was like still really depressed and floundering. And at the time when you have the most pressure to make your best work, I was like, I kind of let that opportunity go to waste some. But then I was like, I'm gonna try to make up for it out of school, which is not what I recommend. It's a lot easier if you can do that in school, but I still had the experience and the feedback, even if I didn't always apply it at the time. I'll still think about it and benefit from that. But I mentioned like changing my practice up with Pinhole is like if you feel like you're kind of in a rut doing the same things, learn something new, even if it's not art. Like learn writing, take up a different hobby, and it's really important to like kind of value yourself like holistically, and not just if you become so um, single-minded about your art or whatever. um, it's not always great. You have to feed that creativity um, broadly by reading, doing other hobbies. And for me, like the big thing is like I like have to be outside to stay happy. I have to like hike and run and all this silly stuff, and going off into the like bushwhacking I did yesterday. I was like, am I gonna die up here? But that, before I did that yesterday, I was like so blah and depressed. So sometimes for me, it's like physically moving and stuff.
Well, it's like you have to get inspiration from somewhere. And so if you're staying,
Whatever it is, yeah.
yeah, and if you're staying stagnant indoors doing the same thing every single day, yeah, you're not encountering anything different. And which is not to say that you have to like leave your house or go for a trip or a hike or whatever. It could just be reading something. I think that has the power to sort of transform
Well,
and,
like you,
and take you somewhere else, at
yeah,
least
totally.
psychologically.
Well, you mentioned gardening. You've started gardening, Emily, and that's something that for me, doing something like that, just when I'm out doing something kind of mindless is when my mind has the freedom to actually come up with new ideas, or make unexpected observations.
Hmm. Well, it's fostering growth in a different way. Um, so creatively I've like hit a wall and I'm struggling with that, but I can grow some cabbage and I can see that progress each day. um
Well, maybe you'll start casting cabbages or something, or
oh, that definitely could become a thing. I'm just gonna rip off Tony Mattelli for sure. Gonna make
um,
a bunch of figures covered in fruit.
just become Ann Geddes. Like,
Where am I going to get the babies from? That doesn't seem ethical. I would need a whole bunch of contracts for that. Um, so
um,
Monica had another question. Do you see your art as bringing awareness to mental health struggles, or just creating from those observations?
well, that's an interesting thing because I've struggled too with how much I want to talk about that, and so in a smaller environment like this with students, like absolutely, I feel like it's a good thing to do to kind of normalize that as a sort of universal thing and not a taboo thing. But there have been times when it absolutely was an underlying motivation for work, and a conceptual one like that cave series in Florida.
Hmm.
It was kind of about the mental rabbit hole you'd go in something like a depression or psychological event like that. um, and it was almost a literal like task I created to kind of symbolize that psychological labor. But
You were sort of referencing a lot, sort of Plato's The Cave, right?
yeah, because and if I'm honest, like my depression became psychotic, so I had delusions, and I think that like I have it's been a long time since that's been a thing for me, but I think it's part of why I love like almost so detailed it's like uh seems hallucinatory or something.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, some of it is also something I keep close to hand, because I mean, there's still some risk and vulnerability. I've had some negative experiences disclosing those kinds of things, with the wrong person who's just like, instead of being like, oh my gosh, that's terrible, they were like, use it against you because you
Yeah.
don't think people are going to do that. But
Yeah.
so at this point, it's more of a motivation for making work. Um, but I think, you know, and the content of my work has become more about environmental concerns. But as I'm thinking about this right now, I'm wondering like maybe those two are definitely related, right? Like the collective
Oh, for sure.
psychological health of our world and society versus the physical environmental health of everything. And if they're one's imbalance can be a metaphor for collective imbalance and well-being.
Hmm. Well, and the global anxiety that exists over, climate change. As you're using an individual sort of experience of anxiety, but in actuality, it's one that sort of we all collectively share. At least those of us that believe in science, and follow that. Yeah. What else? What other questions do you guys have? What are you interested in? We have him here. He is our resource.
This might not be a very conceptual thing, but I asked like some of my professors this, and I think it's interesting to like hear about because like their like high school art or like their like early undergrad art in comparison to where they are now. Because I don't know, I just even though high school is probably a long time ago for like them, it just like I think that's very interesting to learn about young art. Or
Yeah, and that's I still really find that to be very formative for me, and it's something I go back to. I absolutely I had an exceptional art program. I was able to go to half the day. I would go leave my regular high school for 3 years of high school. I would leave and go to the Fine Arts Center, which was a magnet school. Um, and I mean, I had access to really exceptional programming that actually when I had planned to go off to maybe an art school to college, and because of I was like a scholarship finalist for MICA, but then my mom was just like, "You're not gonna go up there, are you?" And I didn't have family support, so I was like, "Okay, we're not gonna fly up there and see it. Okay, I guess I'm gonna go in state to whatever." And but I actually found that like some of it was kind of repetitive compared to the curriculum I'd taken in high school. It's probably not uncommon, but the stuff that I started out very expressive. I was like very interested in like these German expressionists, Kathy Kollwitz, and um, a guy named Jaime Sutin, and I'm trying to think, Egon Schiele.
Mhm.
Um, Probably mispronouncing foreign languages as I always do, but um, I think that's an interesting thing to go back to for me because I have this pendulum in my practice of sort of control and detail, and then reaching a point of working more from a point of catharsis. So I try to like embrace that as the kind of origin of my artistic interest of this very immediate, emotional, raw, messy kind of thing. And so I kind of pushed against it to expand my skill set, but then I go back to it. And the other thing was that in that program I really had I took a lot of photography classes, and the um, pinhole work I did. I mean, that's been the inspiration for returning that. It's like the first project a lot of the times that you would do in a darkroom photography course, but then if you're like me, you do that and you're like, okay, I'm done. I found the thing. You guys can keep going, but I just want to make my own cameras. That was such a magical thing to me. And it was a good thing to build from. So I find that, there's something to be said about like your initial roots and entry points into art and kind of remembering them and that.
I don't know if you have this experience, but do you ever like look back at like the themes that you used to be interested in, either in high school or undergrad? And when you look back in hindsight, you realize that like a lot of your themes remain the same?
Yeah, definitely. I for sure.
I know it's one of the things that I've talked about with all of y'all, which is this idea of like, okay, what is it that makes like the things that you design or the things that you create inherently yours? And we wrote all of the artist statements where you guys try to sort of pin down, an explanation of who you are as an artist. A wild thing will happen, Lauren, where you get further out and you look back at the work that y'all are creating right now, and you're going to realize almost in like full hindsight 2020 that you've always been interested in certain things and they won't go away, and they just stay as like a part of your practice, which is not to say that the artwork looks the same, but your interests can sort of stay the course. It's a weird thing that I didn't realize until like I got further and further away from it, and then I started making the work that I largely built in the Webster facility. And I was just looking back on it, and I was like, oh, this reminds me of like when I was like 19 and in undergrad. It was like I'm still interested in the same things. It's just I have a more sophisticated like craft skill set, and I'm able to do it better now. Okay, Monica's got a good one. Did you ever struggle with identifying as a certain type of artist? I'm a graphic design major, but a lot of my personal work gravitates a lot towards illustrating with paint and other mixed media, and I feel like I don't resonate a lot with digital art.
Yeah, definitely. Because I'm in I have kind of a dual practice between drawing and photography, and I even teach photography now. And my first time teaching digital photography, I was like, I have a slight contempt for digital photography. I'm not really in that, but you realize that the concepts are the same no matter what the approach is. And so I'm always amazed at like what my students can do. And like, I taught them to do that, but it's not that I couldn't do it. I just wouldn't be interested enough to actually do that in digital. uh, but I think, yeah, sometimes like for instance, I'm kind of this year I've been teaching part-time and trying to get like a full-time teaching job, and more this year than I've like making that concerted effort. And you realize that their jobs have specific media clusters, and there's not that many that are like although surprisingly there's been a couple, but drawing and photography and underwater basket weaving,
They normally don't put those two together.
Yeah. So I've kind of, one of the motivations for doing painting is because there's so many job calls that call for drawing and painting, and I realized it was something I kind of wanted to do as well, but I wanted to also have that skill set to draw from for teaching. But so it can make that there be a sense of like dissonance between trying to promote your work, promote yourself as an artist, when you don't fall into conventional categories. So digital, I the same thing with photography, right? I like the happy accident of making my camera from a suitcase. I don't want to make 30 megapixels or whatever, have this high fidelity clarity. But and I think I don't have a good answer for that other than just to stick to your guns, develop fluency in areas where you need to succeed for your career, but just appreciate that your strengths are still going to be there. Like if you have more of a strength in a like a direct process, then there's ways of combining that with digital. You can like, photograph your drawing or painting and then, manipulate it digitally, for instance. So, but it's a hard thing.
I would say I think it's more of a psychological struggle, Monica, to like want to, you feel that you're, case in point, homegirl told me that I don't need to waste my time on painting and drawing because I was in the sculpture program. Now that I'm outside of that, she wrong. And I don't believe her at all. And I completely and totally disagree. I am, and John, you can tell me if you agree with this statement or not. I am a firm advocate for the idea of being a polymath, and gaining as many skills in as many different areas as possible, because I don't think being a polymath will ever work to your detriment. I think it only helps you. And honestly, who gives a shit if they can put you in a box or not? I mean, John is like an excellent example of that because, John, how many different classes have you taught? Like, break it down, the different areas that you have taught at the college level. Emily, you're going to find this really interesting because I think he has taught more varied classes than any other person I have ever met.
I know, which is like, I'm almost embarrassed when I list them out, but so I've assisted in grad school Foundations 1 and 2, film studies, printmaking. I've taught beginning and intermediate drawing. I've taught art history survey 1 and 2, art appreciation, the history of photography, digital photography 1 and 2, and 2D design foundations. I think that's all. So it doesn't sound actually as much as I thought. But
that's a lot. So it's one of those things where like in the first time you get thrown those classes when you're sort of teaching, you don't feel super great or confident about it, and you definitely usually aren't given a whole lot of like time. Like, I don't know if you've had this experience, John, but you usually don't find out what you're teaching until like a week or so before. And then it's like this scramble where you're like, okay, I guess I can do that.
It varies. And sometimes it's like, like a lot of people would like turn down an art history class because it's a lot of content to teach and grade. But I mean, for me, like, yeah, and it was so stressful because I'm also a real introvert, and like, it was one of those classes that you lecture the whole time, and like, you have to like have all the classroom skills of like a K-12 teacher in terms of like, curricula, state standardized assessment units and that kind of thing. But I mean, I'm so glad that I did that because it engages me intellectually in a way that I think I really love. I enjoy being a polymath, and I think about artists that I love. So an example, just for some reason off the top of my head, is Kiki Smith is a great, equally known for her drawings and her sculptures, and excels at both, and they kind of complement one another. And there's lots of examples of that. But going back to the Renaissance too, like that, I mean, this idea of extreme specialization is sort of a new thing. And I kind of understand it because it does take a long time to develop a extreme media fluency. And that's something that I think you should honor, is that like, it takes a ton of time to like become a master at something. And so don't just abandon that, casually if it's an area you have a strength in. But you know, again, you reach walls, you need to expand that, or circumstances change, you might lose your facility, and so that's a good thing. But also, it just, things have a synergizing, I feel like I'm using all these corporate buzzwords like creative job outlook.
Systemic workflow, synergy.
But yeah, I think one of the reasons that when I teach art history, I love, it's really inspiring, is because not only is this such a radical change from this very dark period in history, but I love that like people were just like doing everything. Like Brunelleschi designed the largest dome ever at the time, and he also was a finalist for the baptistry doors, and he, you know, was, and people write like, you know, there are humanist philosophers, scholars, Batista, he also did, you know, was an architect, and you know, the Ninja Turtle, you know, Raphael, Da Vinci, all those people like were interested in science, and there wasn't this kind of absolute separation. Like those things, if you were a skilled draftsperson, like that absolutely complemented an interest in anatomy, because, you know, that's the thing, they were trying to understand how to draw better, but it also kind of complemented science and medicine and invention. So I find a lot of inspiration from just the pure, like the Renaissance seems kind of played out and almost cliche, but it's also just, when you contextualize it, it was such a watershed moment in expansion of knowledge and creativity that I really am inspired by those artists.
I think it takes a lot of gumption too. It takes a lot of gall to just be like, I'm going to not only do this one thing, I'm going to do all of these things. And I do, it is one of those things that when you're faced with criticism, either in the undergraduate level or even in graduate school specifically, they try to put you in a box. They try to specifically get you to pin yourself down in one way or another. And I think sort of like rebelling against that.
Well, and reclaiming it, like this other person doesn't get to label me or to define me. If I say I'm a photographer, I'm a photographer. You don't have the right to tell me that I'm like, what I do isn't valid, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's a thing you have to kind of reach for self-empowerment of just, you know, you decide what that is for you, and not, you know, your classmate, your advisor, your teacher, whatever.
There's a point where it like solidifies, you know? It's like everything is like plaster and water and it's all slurried together, but there's a point in your like career where it just becomes solid, and then you know who you are. Um and listen, sometimes you're going to question it, but for the most part it's like when you're faced with some of those questions coming from an outside source, you actually become more firm in your own like voice.
Yeah, and that's really hard to reach. It takes a lot of time, and sometimes just you receive pushback to the point where you just start to get angry and impatient with people challenging you. But I think um, I've talked about imposter syndrome, and that's definitely kind of a stage. But it's important to just kind of like, I don't know, that this is another kind of asinine sounding phrase, but like fake it till you make it. Just kind of have that, like imagine as if you believe that you were this thing that you kind of are, but are maybe not there yet or want to become, you know, and there's something powerful of just holding that for yourself, and even if others don't, and one day it may solidify, right?
I told this group that anytime they go into a interview or anything like that, that they need to approach everything with a level of justified confidence, rather than the imposter syndrome. Like it's almost like having a mini pep rally for yourself before you go in, which is saying like, I have studied this thing. I have like accomplished like X, Y, and Z. And this is not misplaced confidence, but this is justified confidence. I have earned it. Because I think it's something that like a lot of us like, we inherently want to be that like mousy, like, oh, I couldn't possibly, or I'm lucky even just to get the interview, when in actuality, like, you have to remind yourself that you got the interview for a reason.
Yeah. And I think that's harder for some people than others, but I think, you know, in certain fields and in you're kind of conditioned, and especially in grad school, it's a common thing to leave grad school. The whole program is constantly having to defend and being challenged and stuff. And, you know, and if you start out working at an adjunct or part-time job, then you feel sort of disempowered by that. And so you can't go into like a job interview, you know, with the attitude that sometimes it's very natural to have absorbed, which is defensive. Like you're like, oh no, okay, I'm sorry that no, like you know what you're doing. You're there for a reason. You have this degree, you have this training, and it means something. And people will tell you that it doesn't, but it is valuable. Even if you don't stay in the arts, it's a valuable thing to have an education. And I think that's why another thing I go back to with the Renaissance is this idea of humanism as a value that, and it's kind of more of a liberal arts approach to education. But I'm a big advocate for that, as like education is becoming kind of corporatized and becoming a product, that it's not a product, it's a investment and an experience.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the art school is like one of the weird holdout bastions of like Socratic methodologies when it comes to learning, which is this idea that we do have this in the round conversation where we do ask you guys for input. And we are trying to have a dialogue because, I mean, and you guys probably saw it in your middle school, high school educational experiences where everything got shifted towards standardized testing. You know, art school is one of those few places where we don't do scantrons, we don't do quizzes, we don't do things like that. It's all pure Socratic method. And hopefully it stays that way. Hopefully it does. All right. What other questions or comments do you guys have? Keep it going. I know we talked about I tried to give you guys some resources in terms of like creating commission contracts, and this idea of sort of standard methodologies when it comes to lending your artwork to galleries and museums. I don't know if you have anything specific you guys want to ask after reading those. I also gave Monica, I found you that article on fine art printing. I don't know how helpful it was, and it kind of also seemed like it was an advertisement for that specific printing company, but there was some information in there that was kind of important. And actually, John mentioned, so the University of South Florida does have one of the best fine art printing facilities attached to it, called Graphic Studio. And there's also another one. And if you're interested in like learning about fine art printing as like a potential, not only resource for you as an artist or as an illustrator, but also like maybe a like potential day job scenario that you might want to like gain some of those very niche level skills where you could actually work at a printing company as like your day job. You could definitely look at internships at places like that. I think Graphic Studio primarily gets all of their interns via the student body at USF. But there's other places like a very large fine art printing company. I forget where it's based, but it's called the Tamarind Institute.
New Mexico, maybe.
Yeah, but they are one of like the foremost printing companies in our field. And they're all super nice. I've gotten like the opportunity to meet some of the women that work over there, and they work with like big, huge name artists, and they do edition prints. So it's definitely something that I would like look into to see if they have an internship program. Because again, it's like we have to be creative, right? So we can work in the graphic design and illustration field, but sometimes there's not always going to be a job exactly what you want when you want it. And so it's always good to diversify your skill set. So learning those like printing methodologies could be a fantastic way to supplement your income. It's the same reason why like people who are inclined to use tools, I'm always just like, cool, learn how to use every tool and then you can work in fabrication. And usually, you know, they're always looking for somebody that works really hard and like kind of knows their stuff. So if you manage to develop those skills over time, like it just makes you more and more employable. So what else? Any other questions or comments?
I have a comment. I guess I liked what you mentioned about like, I guess not necessarily labeling or not allowing other people's labels to like define your work, because like I'm a painting major, but I feel like I rarely paint anymore. That's like my afterthought, because I've been doing a lot of like collages. So I just like that idea, because I like tell everyone like, yeah, I'm a painting major. I don't really paint though. People, because like when I tell people like I'm a painting major, like, oh, what do you paint? And I'm like, it's hard to say, because that's not like my main focus anymore. And I just like the idea of like, you know, shifting and even like doing different classes and stuff, and just like diversifying your skill set and not just sticking to one thing, because I feel like that's what I'm interested in right now.
And I think too, artistically, some of these combinations or more experimental areas of practice are, I mean, because we're in a period of art where like it feels certainly as if everything's been done, and it pretty much has. But I think that's when you start getting into some of the newer, less explored territory, is when you're like, you know, for instance, there was a analog photography magazine I was in, and the juror for that was her name's Lynn Beerbaum, but she has a background in glass and she has a background in photography. And what she does, there's this thing called ambrotype, but she makes where you print on glass, but she like makes the glass in a glass fusing blowing thing, and then she prints an image on it. And I don't, you know, that's, there may be other people that do that, but you can probably count them on one hand. So you know, stick to your guns, and hopefully, and if you want to label yourself as a painter just for efficiency, like I'm a painter, but I've been working in like chewing gum for the last year, but you can still call yourself a painter if you want. Like just, you know, use the label if it helps you, but you don't have to be tied to it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know at what stage did you feel comfortable calling yourself an artist, John?
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm there yet. No, yeah, just well, in a certain way, like I think it's just like I feel like I was always like that art kid, and I've always been an artist. It's just been very like, you know, always was drawing or something like since I was a child. So for me, it's been sort of built into my identity. But in terms of, you know, saying I'm a professional artist or something, like, because I, you know, make more of an income on teaching and not really selling work. So even saying that, even though I do art in a professional capacity, it still feels like somewhat like, am I?
That's just the imposter syndrome talking, I think.
Yeah.
And Emily, just to sort of build on what John said, there is a guy that I went to undergrad with who primarily was taking a lot of sculpture classes with me, and he was doing all of these like weird combine installation type things with like cut pieces of fine metal, like sections of brass, and then colored pieces of paper, and he would like arrange it in the corner of a room. He applied to SAIC, which SAIC, the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, has very divided sections of their graduate program. So you have to send a different application for each part of the school. So you have to apply to the painting department. You have to apply to the sculpture department. He applied to both with the exact same work, and he got into both. So he got into the sculpture department, but he also got into the painting department. So I think in a postmodern contemporary sense, we use these labels, but they very rarely have a finite definition anymore. So you can very much be, a painter while working primarily in chewing gum. Like, doesn't matter.
Ew, it just makes me cringe.
Well, that's Tom Friedman. Tom Friedman made entire pieces out of just like chewed up bubble gum.
I don't have as good of an artist Rolodex as I should in my memory.
Well, I know Tom Friedman specifically because he's largely considered a sculptor, but also he is from St. Louis.
Oh, okay.
So it's one of those like artist names that I can throw out there, and I usually know that a lot of my students know who that person is.
That's funny. As soon as I said that, like, I'm sure there are multiple artists that do that as their focus, and I just thought
100%.
The most random thing I could.
All right, nice. Other comments or questions? You got any thoughts for us, Jade? All right, that's okay. Yeah, okay. All right. Well, if you guys are feeling, are you feeling the languish? Do you feel like you're languishing?
Is that me or the class?
I think it's the class. I mean, you got to remember we have like one more week of this. And then it's finals week. So I don't know if your classes are like buttoning up towards
overall attendance is not as good, and participation and everything, but yeah, for sure it's a universal thing.
I think we're approaching the summertime, which it's the finish line. Is anybody with us doing their BFA show? No graduates just yet. That's probably why they aren't logged on. The graduates are busy installing. Does anybody know when the BFA show is?
I should know.
I think it's next weekend.
Next weekend?
I think it's next Friday is like the online reception. I don't really know.
Okay. All right. I'll try to get all of the official information and share it with you guys. Just cuss. All right, cool. Well, I want to thank you, John, for logging in and kind of having a nice conversation with us. We really appreciate it. I think sometimes it's nice to just get anecdotal story information, from people who have been working in the field, out in the real world, scraping by, making work, doing it. So yeah, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to everybody today. You guys, I do want to let y'all know we are again going to have a sort of untraditional last class meeting. So we have an art historian that is actually going to be doing the lecture next week, which you guys should tune in. It's supposed to be pretty interesting. Her doctoral research is on depictions of like sexual assault in like Renaissance paintings or something like that. So it's very Law and Order SVU meets like art history. So I'm really excited about that. And then we're actually, as a part of our discussion group, we're going to be actually the audience for our art history students presentation. So our one art history student that we have at Webster is going to join us, and you guys are, all you have to do is log in and you have to listen and just give her some feedback, because we needed a platform for her to sort of present her work, and Ryan thought that it would be really great to share it with you all. And he's also going to be logging in. I'll be sharing that information with you hopefully within the next few days. Ryan has to send me everything that I need to know. But yeah, so if you guys can, try to make sure that you log in for that, because you will be giving your peers some feedback, which is kind of hard. We would normally be doing like the art history convocation thing like on campus, and we're having to do it digitally. So I would really like for you guys to be there. So okay, all right. Well, I'm gonna close it out a little bit early today, just because I don't want to monopolize too much of your time. John, thank you again. Thank you all for coming and participating as always. If you have any last minute requests for information or things you want me to research for you, just shoot me an email and I will see what I can find on the interwebs. Okay, you guys have a great weekend, and hopefully you can get some nice creative time scheduled in. All right, we'll see you
Thank
guys
you
later.
guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.